There are many things that the conflict between Ukraine and Russia have shown us in the past 8 months. It showed us how this is actually a conflict between USA, NATO, and Russia. It brought the decades-long Nazi problem in Ukraine to the attention of everyone that was willing to see it. It showed how disinformation by Western governments and media is outrageous. We have never seen this level of propaganda before. And in regards to the Nazi problem in Ukraine, Western media went from talking about how serious the problem was to saying it's just Russian propaganda and that there is no Nazi problem in Ukraine. But it also showed how weak, incompetent, and ideologically motivated the Western leaders are. And in today's video I will focus on the European leaders. The USA, European Union, and NATO countries all reacted in a concerted way against Russia after Russia started its special military operation in Ukraine at the end of February of 2022. And that reaction involved not only financial and military support to Ukraine, but also to apply the largest amount of sanctions ever against a country, in this case Russia. The sanctions involved Russian people directly, especially politicians and oligarchs. It also involved the freezing of Russian foreign assets. It involved banning Russia from using the SWIFT system. But it was mostly about sanctioning Russian commodities. Russia is one of the largest commodity producers and exporters in the world. For example, Russia is the second largest oil exporter in the world, second only to Saudi Arabia. Russia is the largest gas exporter in the world. Russia is the largest fertilizer exporter in the world. Russia is the largest wheat exporter in the world. Russia is the second largest aluminum exporter in the world, second only to Canada. And the list goes on. Russia is a powerhouse in commodity exports, and thus any country removing itself from access to Russian commodities is asking for trouble. And that's exactly what the European Union did as part of their sanctions against Russia. They wanted to sanction Russia's gas and oil in order to cripple the Russian economy, prevent the funding of the war, but also to cause political turmoil and reach some sort of regime change in Russia. But what was the clear and immediate problem with these sanctions? Well, the obvious one is that the European Union is one of the largest importers of Russian gas in the world. In fact, in 2021, 45% of the European Union's gas imports came from Russia. Applying these sanctions against Russia would for sure backfire because the European Union was literally biting the hand that feeds them. And that's exactly what happened. The European Union supplies money and weapons to Ukraine, and Russia imposes its own change of rules in regards to gas imports by implementing the Gas for Rubles scheme. With this scheme, all countries still importing Russian gas had to start paying in rubles, which is the Russian currency. In effect, the countries didn't really need to pay in rubles, they just needed to open a Russian bank account that could not be subjected to sanctions, and that bank would then convert the currency with which gas was paid for to rubles. Most European countries refused to do so because of the sanctions. The result was obvious. Russia cut the gas flow to those countries because they did not pay for it. The Eurocrats were quick to complain that Russia was blackmailing them with energy. Ursula von der Leyen said this would be a unilateral decision and a clear breach of contract. But Ursula didn't care about the breach of contracts Western companies committed in Russia thanks to the sanctions she and others applied against Russia. In effect, the idiots in Brussels and in most European countries just expected Russia to accept the sanctions, supply gas, and not get paid for it. Obviously, that was not going to happen, but it gets worse. The European Union continued its implementation of more and more sanctions against Russia, and that included things like wood, rubber, cement, and fertilizers. Yes, fertilizers, something very important for agriculture all over the world. In fact, the European Union had already sanctioned potash from Belarus, because for the Eurocrats, Belarus was already part of the war and was siding with Russia, so it needed to be sanctioned too. Potash is a key ingredient for agricultural fertilizers. Without it, there are no fertilizers. Without fertilizers, there is less food. Less food means more expensive food, and more expensive food means less people can buy food. If less people can buy food, hunger increases. This is what the European Union caused with its sanctions. Higher food prices, less food, and more hungry people. And because the Eurocrats are not capable of admitting their faults, they created the fake outrage over food shortages all over the world, claiming that Russia was blocking grain exports from Ukraine. A ridiculous claim, not just due to the fact that Ukraine is merely the 5th largest grain exporter in the world. Russia, for example, is a much larger exporter than Ukraine. But also because the sanctions on Russian fertilizers and Belarus potash created many more problems in regards to food shortages than whatever grain Ukraine could not export. Furthermore, Russia was not blocking any grain exports from Ukraine. It was Ukraine that mined their own ports and refused to demine them, thus preventing anyone from entering their ports. But eventually a deal was made between Russia and Ukraine to proceed with the grain exports, and Ukraine finally demined their ports. Eurocrats like Josep Borrell claimed the deal was a critical step in helping reduce global food insecurity. The deal was supposed to guarantee that the grain reached poor countries that needed it the most. But was that the case? No, it wasn't. Most of the grain reached richer countries than poor countries that needed it the most. Countries like Ireland, Italy, England, Turkey, South Korea got more Ukrainian grain than anyone else. These are not countries where famine is a big problem, yet that's where the Ukrainian grain ended up. So it was another lie by the European Union, another scheme to make sure they get what they needed, but under the subterfuge that it was about helping poorer countries. Going back to the other sanctions against Russia, when the usual maintenance of the NordStream pipelines happened, a fault in one of the turbines was detected in NordStream 1, which was the main Russian gas pipeline to Europe. With this faulty turbine, gas flow to Europe was reduced considerably. The turbine needed to be fixed, and apparently these turbines could only be fixed in Canada. However, because of sanctions Canada applied against Russia, the fixed turbine could not be sent to Russia. Months later, the turbine was sent to Germany instead of Russia, and Germany didn't really care to send it to Russia. According to the absolutely feckless German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, the turbine was ready to be picked up as if it was Russia needing the gas and not Germany. The ridiculousness of the situation reached a crescendo when Olaf Scholz posed for photos next to the turbine instead of sending it to Russia. Eventually, the gas flow from Nord Stream 1 was halted completely for further maintenance, since the stress on the remaining turbines was now higher, given that one turbine was missing. And with the sanctions in place, any problem with other turbines would mean further reduction in the gas flow to Europe. Protests all over Europe, and especially Germany, were erupting, and one of the things the protesters demanded was the opening of Nord Stream 2 to supply gas to Germany. German politicians always refused to do it, but the pressure existed to do it. Nord Stream 2 was ready to be used for a while now, but it was never opened because Germany never provided a license for it, even though this was a joint project between Germany and Russia. And thus, at the end of September 2022, the Nord Stream pipelines were sabotaged, and gas flow from Nord Stream 1 was permanently ended. As usual, the United States and its puppets, such as Ukraine and most European countries, blamed Russia for it. And this has been the consistent behavior of Western countries during this conflict. Everything is Russia's fault. Recently, Russia has been blamed by the West for bombing the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, a nuclear power plant in territory that Russia controlled for several months. If true, it meant Russia was bombing itself. But of course it was not true. The Ukrainian army was bombing the nuclear power plant to pressure the Russians to leave Zaporozhye by blackmailing them with a potential nuclear disaster. And so blaming the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines on Russia is exactly what is expected from Western countries. But these are the same Western countries that were accusing Russia of blackmailing them with energy. Western countries claimed that reducing the flow of gas through Nord Stream 1 had nothing to do with sanctions, but rather just Russia using gas as leverage. If that was true, with the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines, Russia loses that leverage. So how does it make any sense to blame Russia for the destruction of the pipelines while at the same time claiming that they are using gas to blackmail Europe? To blame Russia of the destruction of their own pipelines directly contradicts what Western countries and media had been saying about Russia, using energy to blackmail them. But I certainly do not expect Western leaders and media to make sense. Something and its opposite is true when it suits the needs of Western leaders. In other words, Western leaders lie more than Pinocchio did. With that said, Russia being responsible for the sabotage of Nord Stream pipelines is the least probable option. So which countries had the motive and more to gain with the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines, and thus the more likely to have sabotaged them? In regards to the motive, let's go back a few years for some context. In 2014, Condoleezza Rice was already talking about sanctions to Russian gas and oil, and how she wanted Europe to depend on the United States gas and oil, and not on Russian oil and gas.
And I also understand that one of the complications is the Europeans, who are very dependent on the Russians for energy supply and business relationships, but they also need to recognize that if Putin is not stopped now, we could find ourselves in a real conflict with Russia down the road.
Well, actually, let me jump in right there. Germany, arguably the strongest power in Europe, at least economically. Right. There's been criticism that Angela Merkel and others haven't been aggressive enough. What do you think of that? Do you think Germany's been as aggressive as they should be? I'm
quite an admirer of Chancellor Merkel, and I heard her statement when she was with President Obama in Washington. I thought it was a very good statement. But now we need to have tougher sanctions, and I'm afraid at some point this is going to probably have to involve oil and gas. The Russian economy is vulnerable. 80% of Russian exports are in oil, gas, and minerals. People say, well, the Europeans will run out of energy. Well, the Russians will run out of cash before the Europeans run out of energy. And I understand that it's uncomfortable to have an effect on business ties in this way. But this is one of the few instruments that we have. Over the long run, you simply want to change the structure of energy dependence. You want to depend more on the North American energy platform, the tremendous bounty of oil and gas that we're finding in North America. You want to have pipelines that don't go through Ukraine and Russia. For years, we've tried to get the Europeans to be interested in different pipeline routes. It's time to do that. And so some of this is simply acting, and acting as quickly as possible.
More recently, Victoria Nuland, one of the masterminds behind the coup in Ukraine in 2014, also said Nord Stream 2, one way or another, will not move forward.
With regard to Nord Stream 2, we continue to have very strong and clear conversations with our German allies, and I want to be clear with you today. If Russia invades Ukraine, one way or another, Nord Stream 2 will not move forward.
And of course, Joe Biden also said the United States would put an end to Nord Stream 2 whenever they wanted.
Let me answer this first question first. If Russia invades, that means tanks or troops crossing the border of Ukraine again. Then there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it.
How will you do that exactly, since the project and control of the project is within Germany's control?
We will, I promise you, we'll be able to do it.
Also notice the absolute embarrassment that is Olaf Scholz. He's standing right next to Joe Biden, as Biden claims he will remove Nord Stream 2 from existence and doesn't say a word. Remember, Nord Stream 2 is a joint project between Germany and Russia, and some companies in Germany hold a significant share of the project. If Nord Stream 2 is destroyed, these German companies have a lot to lose. Yet Olaf Scholz just stands there and says nothing, because, as I mentioned, European countries are nothing more than colonies of the United States. They have no will, no sovereignty, they just do whatever the senile old man in the White House tells them to. It's quite pathetic and shows how weak the so-called democracies of the world are, because no matter who the people in Europe elect, who dictates the policies applied in European countries are unelected bureaucrats that are puppets of the United States. But there's further evidence of the United States' involvement in the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines. Remember the RAND report I talked about in my video about the United States and NATO's hegemony? The one that aimed to supply Ukraine with lethal aid and provoke Russia? Well, it also included the attempt to disrupt Russian gas flow to Europe and make sure that Europe depended on the United States LNG instead. And last but not least, the United States flew helicopters in the same area where the explosions that destroyed the pipelines happened, a few days before the actual explosions. The United States, with the help of other European countries, namely the United Kingdom and Poland, destroyed key European infrastructure, and European governments just shrug their shoulders and accept it, like the slaves they are. The United States literally performed a terrorist attack on European infrastructure. If Europe wasn't a colony of the United States, this would literally be an act of war. The United States is no ally, and just like Henry Kissinger said, to be America's enemy is dangerous, to be its friend is lethal. And what happened with the Nord Stream pipelines is the perfect example of that. No sovereign country would accept this without at the very least severing ties with the United States. However, the European Union is doing nothing against the terrorists that destroyed the pipelines, even though they claim that there would be consequence against those that were responsible for the attacks. After the destruction of the pipelines, Sweden and Germany started investigating the attacks, but soon after said they would not reveal the results with anyone because the information gathered was too sensitive and if shared could be a national security issue. Do you think these countries that have been openly hostile against Russia would not share the investigation results if there was any proof that Russia sabotaged its own pipelines? Of course they would share them, but because they don't have proof against Russia and actually have proof against their own so-called allies, they keep it a secret, which is further proof of the puppets that European governments are of the United States. As for which country had more to gain with the destruction of the pipelines, once again the United States is at the top of the list. Just days after the destruction of the pipelines, Anthony Blinken gave a press conference and was excited that the destruction of the pipelines provided a tremendous opportunity to remove the dependence on Russian energy.
Ultimately, this is also a tremendous opportunity. It's a tremendous opportunity to once and for all remove the dependence on Russian energy, and thus to take away from Vladimir Putin the weaponization of energy as a means of advancing his imperial designs. That's very significant, and that offers tremendous strategic opportunity for the years to come. But meanwhile, we're determined to do everything we possibly can to make sure that the consequences of all of this are not borne by citizens in our countries, or for that matter, around the world.
And we are already seeing the United States profiting from this. Thanks to the energy crisis in Europe and the fact that energy prices increased a lot, several companies are now leaving Europe and moving to the United States. This means less jobs and less tax money in Europe, but it means more jobs and more tax money in the United States. And of course, with no Russian gas available, several European countries are increasing their imports of LNG from the United States. And those European countries, like France and Germany, are already complaining about how expensive the United States LNG is, and that is no way to treat friends. And this is probably the best proof of the idiocy of European leaders. The United States has been using them for their own interests and is now extorting European countries with extremely high prices for LNG. This is what the United States does, and always has done. It exploits everything in its path, and it is now exploiting the idiots in Europe that put themselves in this situation. They did not want Europe to depend on reliable, abundant in supply, and cheap Russian gas. And the result of the idiotic sanctions against Russia is that Europe now depends on non-reliable, non-abundant in supply, and very expensive LNG from the United States. Besides all this, the ideology that moves these European leaders is very well known. It's not just that they are vassals of the United States, they are also green energy fanatics. They want to force the usage of renewable energy, and it doesn't matter to them that solar or wind energy cannot replace fossil fuels, at least not in the near future. They do not care about facts, they only care about their ideology. And Ursula von der Leyen herself said as much, that the sanctions against Russian energy products are a good opportunity to transition to renewable energy completely. And even Bill Gates chimed in to say that the energy crisis is a good thing in the long run in order to force the transition to green energy. Which is what we expect from these elites. They always say crises are good because they do not suffer from them, but non-billionaires do suffer. So of course the energy crisis is not good, and much less because of the transition into green energy, because many European countries have reopened their coal factories to try and cope with the fact that there is no Russian gas replacement. In Poland, for example, the state is going to help people buy coal so that they can heat themselves in the winter. The European energy crisis was manufactured by the United States and by the weak European leaders. The sanctions against Russia caused it, and even though European countries are already in panic, the European Union wants to proceed with these policies and in fact want to impose price caps on Russian oil and gas, which will make things even worse than they are now. European people are already suffering with extremely high energy prices on top of extremely high inflation. There are huge protests all over Europe, but the European leaders don't care. We even heard Annalena Baerbock from Germany saying that she didn't really care about German voters. Her commitment was to Ukraine, no matter what.
But if I give the promise to people in Ukraine, we stand with you as long as you need us, then I want to deliver, no matter what my German voters think, but I want to deliver to the people of Ukraine. And this is why, for me, it's important to be always very frank and clear. And this means every measure I'm taking, I have to be clear that this holds on as long as Ukraine needs me. We are facing now a winter time where we will be challenged as democratic politicians. People will go on the street and say, we cannot pay our energy prices. And I will say, yes, I know, so we help you with social measures. But I don't want to say, okay, then we stop the sanctions against Russia. We will stand with Ukraine, and this means the sanction will stay also in wintertime, even if it gets really tough for politicians.
We are dealing with ideological fanatics. These people do not care about the people that elected them. They only care about their agenda, no matter the costs for European people. And they are just making everything much worse than it already is. And let me be clear, the energy crisis in Europe is not a problem for this winter. It's a problem for many winters to come, because there is no replacement for Russian gas. No other country in the world can increase production to match what Russia was supplying to Europe. And even countries that are huge gas exporters, like Qatar, will take years and a huge investment to increase their capacity to export more LNG. And speaking of Qatar, recently the energy minister of Qatar said that if Europe has no Russian gas, then he believes Europe's problem is huge and it will last for a long time. All of this will directly affect our lives in Europe. Less and more expensive energy, less jobs, and the European leaders have no solutions. In fact, they continue to create more problems, as if this is exactly what they wanted, and I have no doubts that that is, in fact, the case. And to finish this video, I would like to address a message directly to Ursula von der Leyen and all the idiot Eurocrats. Recently, she claimed the following.
Russian military is taking chips from dishwashers and refrigerators to fix their military hardware because there are no semiconductors anymore. Russia's industry is in tatters.
No, Ursula, it is not. Russian industry and Russian economy is doing just fine. It has resisted all your sanctions, and all forecasts have showed that it's doing much better than expected. Europe, however, is not doing so well. Inflation is higher than ever in pretty much every country. There is no replacement for Russian gas, and European people are being asked not to live their lives as they did 8 months ago. Food and energy prices are higher than ever. Countries are buying LNG from the USA at extortion prices, in effect paying much more for much less gas. And if all that is not enough, Europe accumulated a debt of 700 billion euros in regards to energy. Thanks to idiotic policies from you and people like Josep Borrell that claim that Europe is a garden where everything works and most of the world is just a jungle, Europe is no longer that garden. And your ideological crusade against Russia is destroying the prospects of good living conditions for all European people, now and in the future. You are to blame for all our problems, and you should immediately resign, although I really don't expect a dictator to resign. I hope you like this, and I'll see you next time.